When you first watch The Sopranos, you're meant to think Tony is at the top of something big. He's the boss, the king of New Jersey, the kind of man people answer to, not question. But as the show unfolds, the myth starts to crumble. The deeper you look, the more you start to wonder whether this family was ever really a powerful organization, or just a glorified crew, inflated by ego, nostalgia, and a crumbling version of the American dream that Tony's generation inherited but could never live up to. And that question isn't just some outside insult, it's the central wound the show keeps touching. Because the thing about being glorified is that it implies the truth is smaller than the performance. It's not that they have no power, they do. People get hurt, people get scared, money moves, businesses bend. But the show keeps asking what kind of power it is, how long it can last, and whether it has any real foundation beyond violence and routine. If the story they tell themselves is bigger than the reality they live in, then the whole structure becomes fragile. It becomes something that needs constant defending, constant acting, constant reminders. And that's exactly what you see with Tony. He isn't just managing crime, he's managing an image. From the outside, Tony's operation looks structured. There's hierarchy. There's tradition. They've got captains, soldiers, and rules, the same language you'd find in the bigger New York families. But look closer, and the illusion starts to fade. What Tony runs isn't an empire. It's a patchwork of half-loyal men trying to survive in the shadow of something that used to be great. A real empire has depth. It has layers. It has redundancy. If one guy goes down, another one steps in, and the machine keeps moving. Tony's thing rarely looks like that. When a key person disappears, everything wobbles. When a top earner gets killed or flipped, the damage isn't just emotional, it's structural. You feel the gaps. You see how often Tony has to personally intervene, personally negotiate, personally threaten, personally smooth things over. That's not what a stable organization should require. The show makes it clear that Tony's family survives more like a stubborn local business than a national corporation. It's propped up by relationships, not systems. The show itself makes no secret of this. Every season, you see the same pattern repeating itself: dysfunction, greed, and internal decay hidden behind ritual and ceremony. This is not the mafia of The Godfather. There are no polished sit-downs with men in tailored suits discussing long-term strategy or legacy. These are men playing cards in backrooms, shaking down local businesses, running scams through garbage routes, construction bids, and strip clubs. And even when they try to imitate the big version, it often feels like cosplay. The sit-downs they do have are usually rushed, tense, and messy. The conversations aren't about building anything. They're about putting out fires. Somebody got insulted. Somebody wants more money. Somebody wants revenge. Somebody's ego got bruised. The business side is constantly dragged around by personal feelings, and the personal feelings are constantly justified as business. That's how you know it's small. Not the dollar amounts alone, but the way decisions are made. They're reactive, not strategic. The scale is small, almost claustrophobic. And yet, they talk like they're still part of something sacred, as if the golden age of the mafia hadn't already collapsed decades earlier. They speak the language of kings while living like middle managers of crime. That middle manager feeling is everywhere in how they operate. They have meetings that feel like workplace check-ins. They argue over who gets which piece of the pie like coworkers fighting for credit. They complain about their bosses and then pretend it's about respect. Even the way they hang out, the social club atmosphere, it's like a break room with a code of silence. They don't feel like men shaping history, they feel like men protecting their little corner from being taken. And when you compare that to New York, the difference isn't just size, it's confidence. New York moves like it belongs. Jersey moves like it's always waiting to be corrected. That's the genius of The Sopranos. It shows a group of people pretending that the dream isn't dead, clinging to the idea that what they're part of still matters. But deep down, every one of them knows it does not. They feel it in the shrinking envelopes, in the constant pressure from law enforcement, and in the way New York treats them like an afterthought. You can see it in the way they talk about the old days, like that's the only proof they have that this life ever meant something. The nostalgia is constant, and it's not just storytelling, it's a coping mechanism. The older guys want to believe they were part of something honorable. The younger guys want to believe they're inheriting something legendary. But the actual reality is a modern world that's tightening around them. Cameras are everywhere. Phones track everything. Banks flag weird activity. Construction gets audited. Even the legit fronts have paperwork. The world has turned into a system that punishes exactly the kind of sloppy, emotional, impulsive criminality this crew is built on. Tony loves to act like he's in control. He sits at the head of the table, gives orders, resolves disputes, and plays the role of decisive leader. But what kind of power does he actually hold? For most of the series, his so-called family is constantly under pressure from New York. Whether it's Carmine Lupertazzi Sr., Johnny Sack, or Phil Leotardo, Tony is always reacting, never dictating. He negotiates, compromises, and retreats just enough to avoid being crushed. And those compromises aren't just business moves, they're admissions. Every time Tony works something out, it's usually because he has to. He can't just declare terms and expect them to be accepted. He has to be clever, he has to flatter, he has to give something up. That's survival, not dominance. A true boss, especially in the old school fantasy they worship, is someone who can afford to be stubborn. Tony can't. He's always measuring how far he can push before the bigger machine swats him down. That's the key difference between a true boss and a man holding things together through sheer force of personality. The Libertazis treat New Jersey like a minor inconvenience. To them, Tony isn't an equal. He's a provincial capo who happened to carve out his own territory. The way they talk about him behind closed doors makes it clear that respect isn't there. They tolerate him because it's convenient, not because they fear him. And that lack of fear matters more than any polite words they exchange face to face. Because fear is currency in their world. If New York truly feared Tony, they'd handle him differently. They'd plan around him. They'd avoid provoking him. Instead, they constantly test him, pressure him, squeeze him, and assume he'll fold because he needs peace more than they do. That's the posture of someone dealing with a smaller partner, not a peer. They don't see Jersey as a separate kingdom. They see it as an outlying branch that should know its place. He doesn't have the manpower, the political weight, or the earning power to compete with a real family. And Tony knows this. Every meeting with New York ends the same way, with Tony asserting independence while quietly accepting limits he knows he can't push past. That's why so much of Tony's pride feels like desperation. He's always trying to prove something, not just to New York, but to himself. He wants to believe he's building a legacy, but he knows he's managing decline. When he talks about this thing, it's like he's talking about a religion that's losing believers. He has to keep repeating the creed, because if he stops, it becomes obvious that it's empty. It's telling that Tony constantly compares himself to old-school bosses. But when you strip the image away, he's running a mid-tier operation with street-level earnings. His top earners bring in real money, but it's still rooted in scams and rackets that feel small compared to what New York controls. Even his legitimate fronts feel thin. The Bing, the garbage business, some real estate deals. None of it suggests a lasting empire. It's all surface level, dependent on personalities rather than structure. And the show keeps showing you how exposed those legit fronts really are. They're not diversified like a true power structure would be. They're clustered. They rely on the same network of favors, the same pool of contractors, the same local politicians, the same handful of unions and routes and permits. When one part gets investigated, everything starts to sweat. When one guy gets arrested, everyone gets nervous. That's not how a large organization functions. A real family has distance between the parts. Tony's crew has everything sitting on top of everything else, like a shaky stack. The reason this illusion holds together is because Tony believes in it, and so do his men. That belief is essential. Without it, they'd have to face the truth that they're not part of something powerful. They're just a crew, a large, emotional, disorganized crew pretending to be a family because the idea of being small terrifies them. And small is the one thing they can't emotionally survive. Because if they're small, then what are they? Then they're not soldiers, they're bullies. They're not kings, they're parasites. They're not protectors of tradition. They're criminals who missed the window when this life had any romance left. The show makes it clear that the romance is the drug, not the money, not even the violence. The romance is what gives the violence meaning in their heads. To understand why Tony's family feels so hollow, you have to look at where it came from. Tony inherited a structure that was already dying. His father operated in an era when the mafia still carried mystique. There were rules, codes, and a sense of old-world respect that at least gave the illusion of order. By the time Tony takes over, all of that has eroded. Surveillance, wiretaps, and RICO have changed the landscape completely. The world that once allowed the mafia to thrive is actively hostile to it. And it isn't just the law, it's the culture. The neighborhoods changed. The old ethnic enclaves thinned out. The local businesses that used to depend on protection got replaced by chains and corporations with lawyers. The people who used to quietly cooperate started calling the cops, or at least started recording. Even the idea of being scared of these guys became less automatic. They still have power, but it's more like an outdated form of intimidation that only works on certain people in certain places. That's another sign of a crew, not a family. Their influence doesn't travel well. Tony's generation grew up idolizing men like their fathers and uncles, but what they inherited was the wreckage of that world. They didn't build anything new. They just maintained a relic, polishing the shell of something already dead. They repeat traditions without understanding why those traditions once mattered. That's why the rituals often feel like theater. They talk about honor, then cheat each other. They talk about loyalty, then flip the second the pressure hits. They talk about family, then destroy their own families with neglect and betrayal. The code becomes a costume. And the tragedy is that a costume can still control you. Even if you know it's fake, you still live by it because you don't know what else to live by. Look at the men around Tony. Christopher is torn between addiction and fantasies of escape. Polly is paranoid, superstitious, and emotionally stunted. Silvio is the closest thing to stability, and even he breaks under the weight when he briefly has to lead. These aren't disciplined soldiers in a criminal empire. They're damaged men trying to squeeze identity out of a system that no longer provides it. And each one of them shows a different way. The glorified crew, reality leaks through. Christopher wants validation, but he also wants an exit. That's already a problem, because a real family requires people who see it as their whole life, not a phase. Paulie wants respect like oxygen, but he doesn't really understand loyalty as anything beyond personal attention. Silvio looks competent until the moment he has to carry the whole thing, and then you realize that Tony's role isn't just boss, it's emotional anchor. He's the only one who can keep everyone's delusions aligned. Once he's not there, the crew doesn't just lose leadership, it loses the story. In many ways, The Sopranos is about that decay, about how people cling to symbols when the substance is gone. The Italian flags, the rituals, the language of honor and loyalty all become performance. The crew goes through the motions because stopping would mean admitting there's nothing underneath. And that performance gets louder as the reality gets quieter. When the money is good, they don't need to talk as much. When things feel stable, they can relax into the routine. But when the cracks start showing, they talk about rules constantly. They talk about respect constantly. They talk about tradition constantly. It's like they're trying to speak the structure back into existence, like saying it enough times will make it true again. They collect money, hand out envelopes, and talk about respect, but the show constantly undermines these moments with betrayal, selfishness, and petty grievances. Strip away the ceremony, and what's left is a group of men who barely trust one another, who constantly undermine each other, and who make decisions based on emotion instead of long-term survival. That isn't a family. It's a crew that has outgrown its own mythology. And the show proves it over and over through how often Tony has to solve problems that shouldn't exist if the structure was real. In a disciplined organization, you don't get constant internal melodrama. You don't get guys creating chaos because they feel disrespected at dinner. You don't get major instability every time someone's ego gets bruised. In Tony's world, one insult can ripple into violence. One rumor can turn into a crisis. One personal grudge can threaten an entire revenue stream. That's because the organization is emotional, not institutional. For all Tony's talk of hierarchy and loyalty, his command structure is fragile. Every captain has an agenda. Some openly disrespect him, others quietly test his limits. Even the most disciplined among them occasionally question his judgment when things go wrong. The chain of command breaks down again and again. In theory, a real family operates on order. The boss commands, capos execute, soldiers follow. In Tony's world, what keeps things together isn't structure, it's fear, charisma, and routine. And routine is a weak glue. It works until something changes. The moment a major event happens, a death, an arrest, a beef with New York, the routine stops, and you see how little trust is really there. People start calculating, people start hedging, people start making side deals. A true family has mechanisms for crisis. Tony's crew has Tony. That's it. And if Tony is distracted, sick, depressed, or unstable, the whole thing wobbles because there's no institutional backbone. Tony doesn't inspire loyalty through principle. He inspires it through intimidation. People stay in line because they know what happens if they don't. And when you look at how major decisions get made, they're rarely strategic. They're emotional. People are removed because they offend Tony personally, not because they threaten the organization. Violence becomes a way to resolve feelings rather than protect the future. A real family prioritizes survival. Tony prioritizes himself. Everything revolves around his moods, his grudges, and his need to feel dominant. That's not a family. It's a cult of personality pretending to be one. And what's scary is how easily the men accept that arrangement because it matches their own emotional immaturity. They don't actually want a system. They want a father. They want someone to tell them what things mean. They want someone to confirm they're important. That's why respect becomes such an obsession. It's not a business requirement. It's an emotional craving dressed up as tradition. One of the most revealing things about The Sopranos is how obsessed everyone is with respect. It's the word they repeat constantly and the one they violate the most. Tony demands it but rarely gives it. Others chase it without ever earning it. Respect becomes a substitute for something deeper they can't articulate. What they really want isn't respect, it's legitimacy. And legitimacy is the one thing they can't get, no matter how many envelopes they hand out or how many rituals they perform. They can't become legitimate because the world they live in isn't built to grant legitimacy to men like them anymore. Even when they look successful, it's always slightly off. It's always too flashy, too tense, too defensive. The nice house doesn't feel like peace, it feels like a fortress. The expensive car doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like proof. Everything is proof. Proof that they matter. Proof that they're not small. They want the world to treat them like kings, but the world has moved on. The mafia no longer inspires fear the way it once did. Law enforcement has adapted. Other groups have filled the vacuum. Tony's crew doesn't dominate the landscape. They cling to relevance. That's why Tony surrounds himself with symbols of success. The house, the cars, the clothes. These are props meant to project power. But deep down, Tony knows how fragile it all is. And the fragility isn't just financial, it's psychological. Tony is constantly threatened by the idea that his power exists only because people agree to pretend it does. The second they stop pretending, it collapses. That's why disrespect hits him like a threat to his existence. It isn't about pride for pride's sake. It's about the fear that if someone laughs at him, the whole room might realize he's not a king. He's just a guy with a temper and some money who got lucky in a shrinking world. His panic attacks aren't just about stress or family issues. They're about the fear that none of this means anything, that everything he's built is temporary, hollow, and already decaying. The tragedy of Tony Soprano is that he's aware of this on some level. He knows he's smaller than he pretends to be, and that awareness eats at him. The choice of New Jersey as a setting isn't accidental. Across the river is New York, the real center of power. Tony's entire world exists in that shadow. He wants recognition, equality, validation, but he never quite gets it. The Jersey complex defines his leadership. He's always trying to prove that his operation deserves to stand alongside the bigger families. And that complex seeps into everything, even when nobody says it out loud. The way Tony bristles when New York talks down to him. The way he tries to speak with authority, even when he's clearly negotiating from a weaker position. The way he wants to be seen as the kind of boss who can make decisions without permission. But New York's existence makes that fantasy harder to maintain, because it's a constant reminder that there's always someone bigger. Someone with more soldiers, someone with more money, someone with more political reach, someone who can afford to be ruthless without worrying about fallout. But New York never truly sees him that way. Even when opportunities arise, they collapse under politics and disrespect. Tony is played, sidelined, and reminded of his place. He feels it, and it humiliates him. That humiliation turns inward. When Tony feels small next to New York, he compensates by asserting dominance at home, and you can almost track that pattern like a pulse. After certain humiliations, Tony comes back and tightens control. He becomes harsher. He becomes more demanding. He becomes more willing to punish his own people over symbolic slights. It's like he needs to restore balance by proving he can still control something. But the tragedy is that the more he does this, the more he damages the only thing keeping the organization alive. Whatever trust and routine still exists. He humiliates his own people, flexes his authority, and lashes out to reassure himself that he's still in control somewhere. The irony is that the more he does this, the more he exposes how fragile his power really is. Real power doesn't need constant reinforcement. As the series progresses, Tony's family collapses in every sense. The crew shrinks, money dries up, loyalty erodes. By the end, most of the people who once gave the organization weight are gone, dead, flipped, or broken. And when people flip, that's when you really see how family was always a word, not a reality. The pressure from law enforcement turns loyalty into a negotiation. Guys start making choices based on survival, not honor. And the show doesn't present that as shocking, it presents it as inevitable. Because a crew held together by fear and convenience will always fracture when the consequences get real. If the bond isn't moral, it won't survive moral pressure. The parallel collapse of Tony's actual family mirrors this perfectly. The same dysfunction, the same empty rituals, the same emotional distance. At this point, the illusion stops being something that merely props the family up and starts becoming something that actively destroys it. What makes the fantasy so dangerous is not that it fools outsiders, but that it slowly poisons the people inside it. The men around Tony aren't just pretending for show, they're pretending for survival. Each of them needs to believe the family is real, because if it isn't, then every sacrifice they've made becomes meaningless. Prison time, paranoia, broken marriages, violence, fear. Without the idea of family, it's all just waste. And that's why the word glorified is so cruel, because it suggests the sacrifices weren't for something noble, they were for a story that never delivered what it promised, a story that kept shrinking until it became embarrassing. Imagine spending your whole life believing you're part of a legacy, only to realize you're basically a local crew with bigger vocabulary. That realization would break most people, so they avoid it. They double down. They become even more strict about symbolism, even more angry about disrespect, even more obsessed with the performance. That belief turns dissent into betrayal. Questioning the system isn't disagreement, it's heresy. Anyone who exposes the cracks threatens the story holding everything together. That's why people who speak too honestly are pushed aside or eliminated. They aren't just disloyal, they're reminders that the illusion is fragile. Tony understands this instinctively. His rage flares most violently not at financial loss, but at symbolic disrespect. A joke, a rumor, a perceived lack of gratitude. These things cut deeper than missed money because his authority rests on perception. He isn't guarding a family, he's guarding a narrative. and that narrative is basically the last asset he fully controls. Money comes and goes. People can get arrested. New York can pressure him. But the story that he's the boss, that this is a family, that respect matters, that tradition means something, that's the thing he fights for the hardest. Because if he loses that, he loses everything at once. He loses the justification. He loses the identity. He loses the reason he can look at himself in the mirror. The problem is that Tony can never fully believe in that narrative himself. He sees through it too clearly. He knows loyalty is conditional. He knows respect can be forced or faked. That awareness gives him power, but it also isolates him. He can't confess doubt without weakening himself. He can't admit guilt without undermining his position. Every relationship becomes performative, every interaction transactional. The crew senses this contradiction. Tony preaches loyalty but acts selfishly. He demands honesty but punishes it. Over time, belief erodes. What replaces it isn't rebellion but disengagement. People stop seeing the family as a shared future and start treating it like a temporary arrangement. Take what you can. Protect yourself. Prepare for the end. Tony responds by tightening his grip. He becomes more controlling, more suspicious, more reactive. He mistakes obedience for loyalty and silence for respect. The result is a cycle of decay. The more he clamps down, the more isolated he becomes. Power keeps him in place, but it strips away community. Meanwhile, the outside world keeps closing in. Law enforcement adapts. Technology advances. Old rackets fade. Younger generations don't fear the mafia the way they once did. Tony's world shrinks culturally as much as legally. The loss of mystique is devastating. Without it, the family is just another criminal operation struggling to stay relevant.